Did everyone have a great day one? Woo! Me also. Hope you all enjoyed the poster session as well, and maybe some evening festivities afterwards. Welcome to day 2 of the 2025 Stone Living Lab Conference. My name's Katie Dafforn. I serve as a co-director of the lab along with Joe Christo. I hope that you were all really inspired by yesterday's talks and learnings. And if this is your first day joining the conference, then please hold on to your hats, top up with coffee, because we've got a really fantastic day ahead of us again. I'd like to start this morning with a land acknowledgement. The Stone Living Lab conducts research and educational programs in Boston Harbor, the islands, and the land along its shores. We recognize that these lands, including where we are gathered today for this conference, are the unceded and still occupied homelands of the Massachusetts tribe. The Massachusetts people have lived here continuously for over 10,000 years, long before Europeans stole and colonized the land. The Stone Living Lab takes seriously its responsibility to respect people, flora and fauna, and natural spaces, and to incorporate indigenous traditional ecological knowledge into the climate resilience work that we do. We have begun on this journey in partnership with members of the Massachusetts tribe, but we have a long way to go. Decolonization is an iterative and long-term journey. Although we must do a lot of learning, including at the conference today, we must also remember that the Massachusetts, as well as many other tribes and people, have sustainably cohabited with land, water, air, and other non-human relatives for thousands of years pre-colonization. There has not been a time when people have not impacted the land that we live on. Our choice is whether we do so in reciprocity with our ecosystems and peoples or continue the extractive actions that we have significantly contributed to the changed climate we see today. We must continue to talk honestly, openly, and often about how to collaboratively work together toward repairing the harm that has been done by engaging those communities most impacted and co-creating solutions that incorporate lessons we have forgotten. Thank you. In a few minutes, I'm going to welcome Boston Harbor Now President and CEO to the stage, but before doing that, I would like to share a couple of important thank yous. First, thank you to my amazing Stone Living Lab colleagues, who I was so fortunate to be able to collaborate with in this conference. Joe Christo, Rebecca Shore, Brittany Knotts, and Alison Novelli, along with our conference coordinators from Tiffany Beer Events, Tiffany Beer and Kat LeConte. Amazing people. And I have to say, I've only been around for 2 months, so there's a huge amount of planning that's been going on to make the conference what you see today. Thank you to our fantastic conference content committee, instrumental in planning this conference as well. Thank you to all the wonderful colleagues at Stone Living Lab, all of our colleagues at the core partners who make this conference possible through their work. That's including UMass Boston, Boston Harbor Now, the National Park Service, the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation, the City of Boston, and the Massachusetts Tribe. And a big thank you to our Scientific Advisory Committee, who've traveled far and wide, even places like Ireland, coming from afar, and also our Advisory Board and our Executive Committee, who are so supportive of all the work that we do and help to guide us in those efforts. Thank you to all the organizations that we are fortunate to collaborate with in our work from the lab, from the Boston Children's Museum to Woods Hole Group to the Museum of Science, and so many of those represented in this room today, which is fantastic. And thank you to all of our sponsors who make this conference possible through their support. The names can be found in your program, scrolling on our screens, and we also have them on the boards around the room as well. Thank you to Kathy Stone, to Jim Stone, Sonia Plessett, and Bob Gollage from the Stone Foundation for their continued support of the lab. And thank you all. My first Stone Living Lab conference, I've just had such a fantastic time, and it's all of you who make this special. Now it's my honor to introduce Kathy Abbott, who is President and CEO of Boston Harbor Now. Kathy has come full circle since beginning her career on the Harbor Islands as a park ranger in college, leading to Boston Harbor Now today. She is responsible for working with the board and staff to create a welcoming and resilient harbor that benefits everyone in the greater Boston region. And she has a history of leading change through public and nonprofit organizations to advance statewide park planning, management, and land conservation, educate students, and impact resource-based economies. She has never done this work alone and credits great teams and collaborations for her success. Please join me in welcoming Kathy Abbott.
Good morning, everybody. How are we feeling? I don't know about you, but I left here yesterday just completely high as a kite, totally charged. And despite all of the challenges that I know we are all now facing, came away with this tremendous sense of hope. And a lot of that hope is grounded in all of you and all of us, and the fact that we're here today, we're here yesterday, and that we are going to continue to work on what we're working on, because we know how critical it is. It's a real pleasure to be part of this conference. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to be part of this community every day. I want to give a special shout out to our co-directors, Joe and to Katie. They could not be a better team, just like our collaboration, the collaboration between Boston Harbor Now and UMass Boston it's been one of the most exciting things I've been involved in a long time, with a very complementary set of skills and abilities, both in Joe and Katie, and I think, and in our organizations and what we do for the lab. At this conference, we're exploring nature-based coastal resilience at a time when climate science is being curtailed, one might even say under attack. Yesterday, we talked about creating hope. We talked about building community, which is exactly what the Stone Living Lab Conference does. Convening experts to advance approaches grounded in evidence, collaboration, and care for a shared future. Today, in the face of unprecedented change, Boston Harbor continues to stand as a beacon of hope, health, and community. Its public lands and waters, we talk about them in terms of 50 square miles of blue and green public open space, the largest public open space in the region, are vital to our future, to our well-being, and to our economy. Ensuring Boston Harbor continues to beat as the heart of our city and our region, as it has for decades to come and will for decades to come, requires us all really to be acting now, and we know that, which is why we're here. Boston Harbor Now is honored to be a core partner, as I said, with UMass Boston and our public partners, which Katie mentioned, in the lab. The lab and its leadership and talented practitioners is essential to the urgent climate adaptation efforts taking place in Boston, throughout the Commonwealth, the country, and the world. As many of you know, and some of you I think went to Kurt Bosman's talk yesterday in one of the breakouts, the idea for the lab originated with Kathy Stone, which is why the Stone Foundation is so important. But Kathy, really, it was her idea. She was BHN's representative on the Boston Harbor Islands Partnership. And we were dredging the harbor at the time, putting in the new shipping channel, and wanted to use the dredge spoils to help shore up the islands. We were all aware, we all thought of the islands as the first line of defense for our region in terms of protecting us from increasing storms and rising seas. And they were beginning to show significant impacts from these rising seas and increasingly powerful storms. So Kirk, working with Paul and UMass Boston, modeled the 2018 storms and demonstrated that these, I always say 20 to 30 feet, but I think I might be exaggerating slightly. I'm prone to do that. They were very big waves out off of the Brewster Islands in those storms in 2018. And what we knew was that by the time they came through the islands and landed right here in South Boston at Carson Beach, that they were 2 to 3 feet high. And in that modeling, you could see those islands absorbing that wave energy. And you can see the evidence out there. When I was out there, as Katie mentioned, as a park ranger as a kid, the granite seawalls built out of Quincy granite, they were built in the late 1800s for the most part, were for the most part intact. They are now, for the most part, not intact and eroding into the harbor. And that's really just occurred, I would say, in the last 10 or 15 years, that's really accelerated. To further prove the point that the islands are in trouble, the islands were named as one of the country's 11 most endangered properties by the National Trust for Historic Preservation in 2021. The lab began with a desire to protect the islands and to use them as sites to experiment with nature-based solutions and approaches, and to engage the public and to teach the next generation, and we're going to be continuing to do that as we move into the future. Boston Harbor Now was established 9 years ago to ensure that the people of Greater Boston benefit from a vibrant, resilient, and inclusive waterfront, harbor, and islands. We've raised over $35 million in these first 9 years to improve resiliency and we have introduced and facilitated hundreds of thousands of people down to the waterfront, out onto the harbor, and out onto those islands with the idea that these are all public, we all own them, and we want to make sure that, as Katie mentioned, we want to make sure that everybody is benefiting from them. Our resiliency work includes our focus on implementing the research of the Stone Living Lab and the many plans that Brian Sweat mentioned at the end of the day yesterday. This means working with neighborhood groups to support their plans, working with the legislature and the administration to improve permitting and regulation, educating and engaging the public with our public partners, raising funds, and working with public and private partners to implement the kinds of improvements that Brian talked about. I want to do a shout out and a thank you to Environmental Secretary Rebecca Tepper, who just last week added $200,000 to the real-time monitoring project for additional equipment. So really excited to see that happening. In addition to the lab, Boston Harbor Now also supports the Coastal Resiliency Working Group, which I co-chair for the Green Ribbon Commission, and that group is really focused on, again, it's about implementation of resiliency, focusing on the regulatory challenges, the financing challenges, and the governance challenges. Finally, Boston Harbor Now is focused on working with the City of Boston and all of the public-private property owners along the waterfront in Boston, there are 368 of those, to implement something that we call Harbor Walk 2.0, which builds on the success of the public access provided on the 43 miles of the 47-mile coastline of Boston, and to include the Harbor Walk's role, to add to that role, giving it a very important role in resiliency. It's involved developing design guidelines and models of engagement to use the Harbor Walk to increase resiliency in our communities. This year, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Harbor Walk, Go Harbor Walk, with an increased investment and to further realize that potential. For the first time, we'll be hiring a full-time Harbor Walk manager to work on both the issues of resiliency and access with our planning and policy team at Boston Harbor Now, and with all of you. Our work with many of you to ensure that these beautiful places are used and protected and our communities are prepared for the challenges ahead is something that Boston Harbor Now takes great pride in. Our dedication to environmental stewardship, climate resiliency, and community engagement is a shining example of the collective effort required to confront the crisis we face today. Boston Harbor Now doesn't do anything that isn't in partnership with another entity, public, private, for-profit, nonprofit. So much has happened in just a few short years. It seems like a long time ago that we had the conference, as demonstrated by so many of the conversations yesterday. The Chancellor did an amazing kickoff, which I think inspired us all. It was an inspiring call to action and took us from here in Boston to the international stage. Katie Dafforn's keynote took us from Australia to Boston via the Earthshot Prize and via her brilliantly successful International Living Seawalls project. And Atia Martin, I love Atia Martin. Atia, from All Aces, talked about the 4 R's of resiliency, resourcefulness, redundancy, rapidity, and robustness, and challenged us all to collaborate and to act together, and to do it now. There were also so many great breakout sessions yesterday, and there will be more tomorrow, just as many today, and terrific trips tomorrow, so hope everybody enjoys those. This afternoon, we are really excited and very lucky to have Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll joining us. Kim has dealt with these issues on the ground in the city of Salem as mayor and is working hand in hand with our Governor Maura Healey to lead the climate effort at the state level. Not only benefiting the residents of the Commonwealth, but also setting a national example as we look to share what we're learning here in the Commonwealth, here in this conference, far beyond our borders. And finally, I hope you'll come to the harbor tomorrow and get down to it or out on it to connect with each other, to reflect, and to be part of the future that I hope we're all building together. Thanks, and enjoy your day.
Thanks so much, Kathy, for those words and all that you do. Now it is my honor to introduce our Dean of the School for the Environment, Professor Carol Thornber. Dr. Carol Thornber joined UMass Boston as the Dean of the School for the Environment in July 2024, bringing with her a rich tapestry of experiences and a deep passion for the natural world. Her journey into environmental science was sparked during a transformational semester spent off campus as an undergraduate, where she engaged in scuba research at a university marine station. This immersion in nature solidified her desire to pursue a career dedicated to environmental stewardship. And prior to arriving at UMass Boston, Dr. Thornber was a professor of environmental science at the University of Rhode Island and focused on the impacts of climate change on marine systems for over about 20 years. Dr. Thornber is particularly drawn to UMass Boston's mission to support and elevate students, emphasizing the university's student-focused approach. She recognizes the importance of gaining different perspectives and believes that embracing new cultures and environments is essential for personal and professional growth. Please welcome Dr. Thornber to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. First, I want to thank Katie for the lovely introductory remarks about me, and Kathy, it's an honor to follow you in giving opening remarks. I'd like to thank you all for coming to day 2 of the Stone Living Lab conference this year here at UMass Boston. We had a wonderful day yesterday with a sold-out attendee list. I know you all know that. You were here. And I'm so pleased that so many of you are here today as well to continue learning and conversations and meeting everyone else here for those who haven't met yet. As Katie mentioned, I'm Carol Thornber. I'm Dean of the School for the Environment here at UMass Boston. At the School for the Environment, as our Chancellor Marcelo Suarez Orozco mentioned yesterday, we have a sustained and vibrant program in education, research, and community outreach and engagement. And all of that focuses on the myriad ways in which environmental issues and challenges and solutions face today's society and the built in the natural worlds that surround us. You can't help but just look at our location on the peninsula to see that the water and climate change is right here. Our faculty in the School for the Environment and affiliated faculty conduct groundbreaking research in many fields related to the environment and sustainability. And some of these topics include projects such as coastal resilience, as was mentioned, hydrology, impacts of microplastics on marine and coastal systems, sustainable aquaculture, environmental justice, sustainable transportation, and affordable housing, among other areas. Everything that we do in the School for the Environment is done through a focus on the environment and social justice as being a key component in all that we do. We're also incredibly fortunate in the School for the Environment to have the expertise and knowledge of research staff in the Urban Harbors Institute, in our Mass Bays National Estuary Program, in Living on Earth through Public Radio International, our Nantucket Field Station, and of course, our Stone Living Lab. UMass Boston has made considerable investments in the School for the Environment over the past few years, resulting in 3 faculty hires for this current academic year, including our most recent addition of our distinguished professor, Katie Dafforn, from Macquarie University in Australia. And we're in the midst of several more faculty searches ongoing this year. So stay tuned for our new breadth and depth of expertise going forward, hopefully starting this fall. Our students, both our undergraduate and graduate students, are an incredibly important and vital part of the School for the Environment. Through hands-on interactive classes, research opportunities, mentoring programs, and career pathways, among others, we serve the needs of the citizens of Boston and the world in providing a first-class education in environmental science, sustainability, urban planning and community development, and marine science and technology. Our locational endowment here on Boston Harbor provides unparalleled access for our students, staff, and faculty to learn, conduct research, and perhaps even in their free time, do a little bit of recreation using our aquatic resources that are right here on campus. I didn't get to do that last summer, but I'm determined this summer I'm going to get out there on the water a little bit. I'm delighted that UMass Boston has a strong existing partnership with Boston Harbor Now, and I want to acknowledge my colleague Kathy Abbott in her leadership role there. It was wonderful for me when I came into UMass Boston last summer to come into a very wide and established set of networks with the Stone Foundation, Boston Harbor Now, and many of the other entities that are represented here in this room today and beyond, and to continue to build on and enhance those partnerships. Over the past several years, the Stone Living Lab and its dedicated federal, state, and local partners have contributed significantly to research and monitoring, education and engagement, policy innovation, and climate preparedness for the greater Boston area and the world. As a marine scientist myself, I can say firsthand that these efforts and these focus areas are cutting edge. They're designed with care and input from a variety of constituents, and they have the potential to be transformational across many disciplines and intersect many aspects of human life. I have been welcomed with open arms into the greater Stone family, and I appreciate the support and leadership of Kathleen D. and James M. Stone, as well as the guidance of Sonia Plessett and Bob Gullidge and the Stone Foundation. I look forward to more great things to come from the Stone Living Lab and to meeting with more of my colleagues across the Stone Living Lab ecosystem today and tomorrow. And now, without further ado, let's move on to our program for today.
In a moment, I'm going to welcome David Sittenfeld of the Museum of Science to the stage to introduce our keynote panel this morning, Research and Resilience, Lessons Learned from the Field. David Sittenfeld serves as director for the Center for the Environment at the Museum of Science, where he has worked for over 25 years leading the museum's work on projects for NOAA, NASA, NSF, DOE, the Sloan Foundation, and the United Nations. He co-led the NOAA-funded Citizen Science, Civics, and Resilient Communities and Science Center Public Forums projects, which implemented science to civics activities at 30 US science centers on extreme heat, drought, extreme precipitation, and sea level rise. David led the Wicked Hot Boston and Wicked Hot Mystic projects, which identified heat and air quality related vulnerabilities in over 20 communities in Greater Boston through community-engaged participatory science, and is a member of the leadership team for the NOAA-funded Center for Collaborative Heat Monitoring. David holds a PhD from Northeastern Uni, where he researched participatory methods and geospatial modeling for public engagement about climate-related hazards. Thank you, David, for moderating, and to our panel as well, who are going to come up onto the stage. Please welcome David.
Good morning. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you have some coffee here. My name's David. As Dr. Dafforn said, I work at the Museum of Science just up the Red Line. Please come see us. We make 20-foot lightning bolts. I want to start by thanking the Stone Living Lab folks for putting together this really inspiring panel, and I think it's a fitting panel too. We'll talk about that. It's been so wonderful to work really closely with our partners with the Stone Living Lab over the last year or two, and also with our close colleagues at the Boston Children's Museum about how we can engage communities so that the kinds of nature-based solutions that you're all researching and implementing will reflect the priorities and perspectives of everyone that they're designed to serve. And I think the Stone Living Lab is just such an inspiring example of that kind of thoughtful, interdisciplinary, cross-complementary knowledge that's required to do that, not just in words, but in actual deeds. And I just want to echo what we just heard. This was such an amazing panel yesterday, just such an amazing day yesterday, rather. I learned so much, and it gave me a lot of hope. We've called this panel, the panelists and I, Research and Resilience, Lesson Learned from the Field, because that's a good name to have for something like this, but we gave it a subtitle. The subtitle we gave it is Nature-Based Solutions Are a Team Sport. Because this conversation is going to focus kind of on two things. It's going to focus on the connections and the feedbacks between biodiversity, ecological resilience, and nature-based solutions, which of course is kind of a theme for this panel, but for this conference, but we decided we should also have a particular focus in this moment on collaboration. Each of the people on this panel is an expert with respect to the topic of biodiversity assessment. So we're going to talk about biodiversity assessment and how it pertains to nature-based solutions, but we're specifically going to talk about how that work requires collaboration across disciplines and collaboration across ways of knowing. And along the way, we'll also be talking about the role of traditional ecological knowledge, education, and ecosystem services with a particular focus on hope. And I do just want to take a moment, obviously we heard a lot about this yesterday, to specifically say that this is all happening against the backdrop of the first ever National Nature Assessment, which was the first federal effort to assess the status, observe trends, and future projections of American America's lands, waters, wildlife, biodiversity, and ecosystems, and the benefits that they provide, including connections to the economy, public health, equity, climate mitigation, adaptation, and national security. And some of the panelists you're going to be hearing from were involved in that effort, which was a huge and very ambitious undertaking that required all kinds of new collaboration. New collaboration, I think, that built and was not the same for what was created for the National Climate Assessment because of the particular role of nature in our lives and our society and the value that it has for us as human beings. So I think some of that might come up. And we'll touch, I think, in a hopeful way on ways forward for nature-based solutions to inform policy given the specific moment that our society is in. I'm going to introduce the panel in 1 second, and it's really amazing. I think even though what we're going to do stands between you and the next session, which is a performance of the Boston Lyric Opera, I think you'll be transfixed anyway. And I'm going to introduce each of them individually, and I think that they can come up and join me on the stage. The mics are off, so I think when you sit down, just flick them on when you get to your seat, and if they don't work, I guess we can all just sing. Katherine Machalava is the inaugural planetary health scientist under the Nature Conservancy's Human Dimension Science team. In this role, Katherine is excited to make health-positive conservation interventions more visible to accelerate progress towards the Nature Conservancy's conservation, climate, and people goals. She serves on the One Health high-level expert panel advising the Food and Agricultural Organization, the United Nations Environment Program, the World Health Organization, and World Health Organization for Animal Health in their collaborative work. She holds a master's in public health from Dartmouth Medical School and a PhD in environmental and planetary health sciences from the City University of New York School of Public Health. Let's welcome Dr. Machalava. I just go all the way over, I guess. Scott Edwards is the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology and Curator of Ornithology in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University, where I often bring my child on Saturdays. Dr. Edwards holds a PhD in zoology, which I've learned is now called integrated biology. I learned that over the last 2 days from UC Berkeley. He's a scientist with broad interests in the evolution of life on Earth and the processes that have generated biodiversity. He uses birds as models to study patterns of speciation, biogeography, evolution of the genome, and the process of adaptation. Importantly, Dr. Edwards oversees a program funded by NSF to increase the diversity of undergraduates in evolutionary biology and biodiversity science. He's a fellow of AAAS and a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he's served as president of no less than 3 international scientific societies: the Society for Study of Evolution, the Society of Systematic Biologists, and the American Genetic Association. Let's welcome Dr. Edwards. And lastly, we have Paige Warren, who is professor and department head of conservation biology at UMass Amherst. Dr. Warren's research seeks to understand processes generating and maintaining biological diversity in a world that's increasingly becoming dominated by human beings. Her research takes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding patterns of biodiversity in urban regions and their underlying ecological and social processes. Her background is in behavioral and evolutionary ecology with a long-time focus on birds. She holds an PhD in integrative biology from the University of Texas at Austin. And a guiding principle for Dr. Warren's research is that the typical indices of urbanization, such as human population density, describe only a portion of the habitat structure that's important for wildlife. Let's welcome Dr. Warren. Thank you. I'm going to model being a good moderator and turn the switch on of my microphone so everyone else remembers to do that. And I'm also going to look every so often over at Katie, who's going to brandish a number at me about how many minutes we have left. So the way this is going to work is I have some questions that we talked about before, and I encourage you to kind of go back and forth. I'll prompt you every so often. I looked in the Whova app. It didn't look like anybody sent questions in ahead of time. So what we'll do is at a certain point, I will just kind of ask if the audience has questions, and there's roving, very nice people who have microphones like this that we can fold in our conversation before we have kind of a little bit of a wrap up. What a group this is. Thanks to the organizers for putting together such a smart and interesting group of human beings. And I thought it might makes sense just to have each of you talk a little bit about your specific work at the intersection of biodiversity, ecosystem health, and nature-based solutions. What is your window into this particular work? And we can start with you.
I was afraid you were going to do that. It's so hard to follow up. I think you also should be glad that I am talking and not singing, that you have someone else singing later. So, all right. So, yes, I'm coming here not as a marine scientist, and as David said, I've worked mainly in urban ecosystems over the recent period of most of the last 20 years of my career. And so I guess what I'd invite you to do for a moment is picture yourself, what is nature in the city? And like, what are you picturing? What are you thinking about? I think when we say the word nature, we're often thinking of something that's kind of far away from people, isolated, large and expansive, maybe, I'm sorry, I'll whack you in the face here. And yet there's nature everywhere. Anywhere that there is soil, that there are plants, that there are earthworms, that there are birds, there's all of those pieces of the environment. There's nature. And there's nature, on your tables, actually, at the moment, unless those are fake. But and there's nature right outside this building. We can look out at the water. So what does that mean? What kinds of nature do people need to have access to have a sustainable, for us to have a sustainable world, for us to have human well-being? Those are the kinds of questions that have driven my work. I came to it by being someone who was headed out away from people. I was going to be the ecologist that goes out and, padded around West Texas looking for birds. And then I kept finding birds that kept taking me back to people, because there are birds that are drawn to the resources that people provide and live in close proximity to us, live really sort of intertwined with our lives. And I saw lots of meaning in that, in the people that I interacted with in the work that I was doing. So I guess that's one big sort of focus, is this kind of reciprocal relationship between how do we make places better for people and for wildlife at the same time in cities, which we often think of as sort of biological deserts, and yet they can be places of hotspots of resource inputs by people, places of evolving evolutionary novelty, as we've sort of created new sort of forces that select on the creatures, and they come up with new solutions to problems. So there's a lot to be learned from the organisms in cities. What does it mean for people? So again, another big area of focus for me has been people's access to nature. And we've observed big disparities in access to nature around race, income, any kind of sort of marginalized community. Many times we find the pattern that marginalized communities have lower access to tree canopy cover, to park and green spaces, and specifically to biodiversity. So when we've measured things like species richness for birds, we see lower bird diversity in lower income, predominantly communities of color in many cities, though not everywhere. And that's one of the things that we could maybe dive into a little bit more. That maybe a narrative that's always the case is also not helpful. So we've tried to figure out what's driving that, what are the consequences of that for people. So maybe I'll stop there and see if we want to pass on to somebody else. Yeah,
we'll go to Scott in a minute, but I just want to say, with a focus on hope, what you were talking about really made me think of an inspiring participatory science project, the Celebrating Urban Birds project that's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. If you don't know about this project, it is it gives me a lot of hope in the ways that they really think a little bit about meeting people where they are and using what everyone's lived experience is as a window into their connection with biodiversity through birds. So thanks for bringing that forward. Dr. Edwards, please tell us a little bit about sort of your window into this, intersection between ecosystems health, biodiversity, and nature-based resilience solutions.
Well, we better be careful on this panel with two ornithologists. That's a dangerous combination. No, thank you so much, David. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm very excited to connect with the Stone Living Lab and all the folks working around Boston. As David mentioned, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and that phrase might sound a bit obscure and perhaps irrelevant to our pressing challenges today, but it's a really great field because it is focused on how biodiversity changes. And of course, we often think of evolution as occurring over millions of years, for example, but we know now, of course, that we're in the 6th great mass extinction as we're speaking. And the environmental changes that humans are applying to the landscape are changing organisms and landscapes in real time. And so this is an unprecedented time in a number of ways. And in many ways, my research since moving to Boston 23 years ago is very curiosity-driven. My goal when I teach ornithology is to get students outside curious about the amazing wildlife they're seeing, particularly the birds, and through that to engender a love and respect for biodiversity. Nonetheless, as I've taught students, as I've interacted with diverse groups around Massachusetts, I'm on the advisory board of the Massachusetts Audubon Society. I don't know if there's any Mass Audubon folks here, but it's become clear that we need to shift our lens in terms of tracking what's going on now. How is biodiversity changing? What can we do to mitigate the challenges wrought by human excess? And so it's been really exciting to think about how my skill set and how the resources I have access to can help us in that endeavor. And so, as David mentioned, I'm curator of ornithology at the Harvard Natural History Museum, which hopefully you visited. You might have visited the amazing public displays, which are really an incredible showcase of diversity, not just in the Massachusetts area, but across the globe. You may not be familiar with the research collections, which are now underground, albeit in state-of-the-art facilities, which are basically like a library of biodiversity. We can track species through space and through time, and we have an amazing record of biodiversity change in the New England area. And it's resources like this that really give us a time lens to see what's happened in the past and how things are changing now. And it becomes ever more critical to document biodiversity these days because the pace of change is so rapid. David also mentioned my interest in getting more diverse audiences interested in environmental science. And I don't think we have to convince this audience how important that is. In my field of evolutionary biology, it's not as diverse as it should be. And I've often wondered, what is it that is causing the imbalance in diversity? And so I've tried to answer that challenge through teaching and just through being a role model, getting students to realize that being a scientist, being a steward of nature is a really exciting and a wonderful opportunity. And I think education's a great way to do that. And trying to impress upon students just the need to be aware of what's going on around them, understand some of the differences in biodiversity in urban spaces versus other spaces. This is the kind of awareness that we want to engender in our students, to have their eyes away from their iPhones and in the amazing world around them. So, thank you.
Thanks so much. A lot to dive in there. I think one of the things that really resonated with me, you talked about sort of like this amazing repository of objects that you have in your museum, not only as something that we can study, but as the idea that each of those has particular properties that we can use when considering these nature-based resilience solutions that we need. And so we'll get to that idea of this as like a toolkit for us to figure out how we can use the power of nature to help us become more resilient to the changes that we face, not only of climate change, but of biodiversity loss. So important to bring up. Thank you. Katherine, tell us a little bit about your perspective on this, through the lens of environment and health.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I just want to say, like birds a lot, also love bats, a lot of ecosystem services we could compare there. But I think, when we look at health, we often look in a really different silo. And I'm so thrilled to see in this conference that we have so many different disciplines, here in the room, but also in the overall design of the living labs. I think health, there's a real opportunity there. And when we look at the disparities that are related to health outcomes, and they're really significant. When we look at climate change and biodiversity loss and those interactions, we see that, of course, those who are most exposed, most vulnerable, are really suffering the most. So I think this fundamental inequity that we have to be thinking about when we look at health today and tomorrow, and many communities today are already impacted by climate change and biodiversity loss, even if those are not always getting the attention that they need in terms of the burden. So I think the challenge is that there is right now our treatment of nature is, of course, not resulting in good health outcomes. I think the opportunity is the positive benefit of nature-based solutions. We benefit from these every day when we think about watershed protection, when we think about the thousands of ecosystem services that nature provides when nature is intact and really given the stewardship that it deserves, and the opportunity to really invest in nature-based solutions for health. So at the Nature Conservancy, we recently started a human dimension science team about 1.5 years ago, and under that we have a planetary and human health initiative. And planetary health, there's a lot of activity in the Boston area, so you've probably heard about it, but really looking at the connections between humans, other species, the environment. These are really fundamental connections. And then the way that we're changing our environments in good and bad ways for health, what we can really do to have those positive benefits from nature-based solutions. There are related terms like One Health, other holistic terms. I think we'll talk a little bit about traditional ecological knowledge, but really learning from one another and seeing these interactions. So this is something that we're trying to do really systematically now at the Nature Conservancy to build in health as a positive outcome. It's very effective in terms of getting people on board with conservation activities and climate action activities, and then really thinking about durable conservation outcomes too. People care about their health, their own health, their community health, their children's health, so really thinking about that common denominator about health being so top of mind, even if you don't appreciate that bats eat mosquitoes for that reason, you appreciate that you're not going to maybe, be at risk for West Nile virus. So, those connections that we can really make to health, I think, are so profound, and we want to be screaming them from the rooftops and getting people on board and really seeing the value of nature-based solutions.
Thank you so much. And the Nature Conservancy in and of itself is such an interesting, complementary, interdisciplinary organization, right? Thinking about sort of how to protect these natural spaces and what the ecosystem services that they provide are, but now having this connection that you're leading through, its explicit impacts and influences on our health as human beings brings forward all those human dimensions that you talked about, including the disparities that exist among populations as we all face these threats, but not all of us face them the same way because of historic harms and marginalized ways that we've created and shaped our urban and exurban spaces in ways that people experience these changes differently. So important when we think about these kinds of nature-based solutions so that they will work for everyone and so that they respond to the priorities and specific lived experiences that everyone has when these nature-based solutions are implemented in their communities. I'm sure we'll get into that, but thank you for those thoughts. And I think each of you touched a little bit on what I was hoping we would dive into first, which is the role of collaboration in this interdisciplinary work. I think, there's a lot of collaboration that has to happen to implement any of the stuff that I heard about in the panels yesterday, right? I went to all of those sessions, and so there are people that need to think a little bit about how we can borrow from nature and how we can learn from nature. There are people that have to think about how we engineer and design these natural systems in ways that will work not only for ecology, but for the people and, human systems that they're put into. We heard a lot about that from Dr. Dafforn when she gave that amazing keynote yesterday, the collaboration between the industrial designers that she was working with and these people that were marine scientists, working on this. I found that fascinating. And then there's also, I think, collaboration with the policy world to figure out how is this stuff going to get permitted, implemented, paid for, not just taken down the next time somebody wants to try something new in that area. Like, all of these are really important collaborative spaces. So I thought it would be really important to hear a little bit from you all about sort of how you've experienced and just learned as people working in this area about the kinds of collaborations that are required. What are the kinds of expertise and knowledge that are involved in connecting biodiversity assessment and nature-based solutions implementation? How do people work together in ways that you've noticed or you've been part of to apply that knowledge at local to global scales? And let's start with Katherine.
Well, I think just getting in the room is really important. So I think, it seems really overwhelming, and I was so excited that yesterday there was a session on integrating nature-based solutions in engineering. I mean, we could have that session for every sector. And so that's what, I think in terms of a health lens, where are those intersections? Maybe there are some really feasible things that can be done now. I saw mental health benefits are being looked at in the context of the living seawalls. It's really exciting. Maybe there are some other outcomes that for the long term we can start monitoring that do relate to health and then really have that evidence base. So there are certainly gaps in what information we have, what is needed to really fill those information gaps and take the needed actions. But I think just getting and working together, having that process in place, and I was so delighted to see the Boston Public Health Commission on the climate resilience office task force, I think it was. And, so I think these are happening. We need them to happen more. We need them to happen in research. We need them to happen in training. I think from the health sector side, the way we think about these interactions is often on the risks and the impacts. We really need to be thinking about, what is the prevention and that value of it, and how do you measure that from taking these actions that are really upstream, so that it really avoid those increased heat island, heat exposures. Really, taking those protective factors from the start and building them into your interventions. I think there's certainly a role for policy. There's certainly a role for community action to really hear how people are affected and what their priorities are, their values. I think we also have to change a little bit of how we think about framing in general, not just clinical outcomes once you're sick in the hospital, but really day-to-day what that means for our health and how we relate to the environment and really that value. But I think just getting in the room, working together, if you have colleagues who are in health programs, bring them to your meetings, invite them to your seminars. Let's have a session at the next Stone Living Labs conference really on that health intersection and every other potential sector. I think it's sometimes just increasing the awareness, and people are so passionate then about doing their part.
Thank you so much. Scott, as somebody thinking about evolutionary biology and its connection to ecology and these nature-based solutions in the realm of an educational institution, what are some of the kinds of collaborations that you participate in regularly, and maybe is there an example of how you've collaborated with someone who brought complementary different expertise to you that was really helpful in thinking about these issues?
Sure. I mean, academia is famously siloed, and we tend to not look as broadly across skill sets and different perspectives as we should. But we know now from lots of research that getting diverse perspectives in the room is going to make the science better. It's going to make the policy better. And so it's been very exciting to think about, to envision just collaboration being the norm and interdisciplinarity being the norm. And I've been fortunate to have a few experiences of that, often coming from students. It's the students that, in my experience, that are really pushing the envelope. And so, for example, about 10 years ago now, a student at Harvard came to me and said she was really interested in understanding what the chemical effects on isolated seabird colonies would be. This was the kind of thing that I didn't have a lot of expertise in myself, although I had studied seabirds in other contexts. And we brainstormed, what could we do here? And I had some experience working with albatrosses. These are big, amazing seabirds with close relatives, the storm petrels that nest right in the vicinity of Boston Harbor on the islands. And what we ended up doing was taking advantage of the collections in the museum, which in the case of the black-footed albatross go back to the 1880s. We had a time lens all the way for the past 140 years. And we teamed up with folks from the School of Public Health who measuring heavy metals like mercury was their daily bread and butter. And we were able to show essentially that despite living on very remote, apparently pristine islands in the middle of the Pacific, these birds were actually accumulating lethal levels of mercury over the past 140 years. And so that was, for me, an example of putting different skill sets together to come up with an observation that we just might not have occurred to us, and which has a definite conservation, a pressing need. And I just want to end by saying that, there's often a perspective that says, well, science is somehow objective, and we would all essentially converge on the same answers and potentially the same questions. And this couldn't, of course, be farther from the truth. Science is something that everyone brings their person to, and precisely the diversity of questions we have is going to be regulated by the diversity of perspectives that are thinking about science. And that's why collaboration with very diverse perspectives is so important. So,
thanks so much. I think, Dr. Warren, same question to you as somebody who's working on this intersection between biodiversity and sort of urban environments and how we can use nature to help make these urban environments and our relationship with nature more equitable.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to touch on a couple different kind of strategies around collaboration that I've seen over the years. I've worked in a lot of collaborative environments, both in academia and sort of in partnership, outreaching from there. And I guess one of the first things I want to bring up is humility, which academics are not really known for, and yet is really the sort of key thing to collaboration is to recognize that you're meeting someone else who has things to bring to the table, and that you have to come with that humility about what you know about it. And one of my colleagues calls it an intellectual handshake. Like we have to meet each other part way. I have to learn enough about you and what you're bringing that I can meet you part way and bring what I'm bringing part way too. So that's an interpersonal sort of dynamic aspect. There's also, I think, systemic things that we can think about, sort of institutional structures and things that can foster more collaboration. And so one of the things that has really fostered my ability to be an interdisciplinarian, we'll just put it that way, is through the National Science Foundation's Long-Term Ecological Research Network, which is a set of, it's a funding mechanism that allows scientists to do long-term work. Grants are usually 2 to 3 years, right? So to have a funding mechanism that's thinking in the decades, and that allows a team of scientists to come together and kind of release that pressure that you've got to come up with an answer tomorrow. Maybe we can sort of like let these relationships build. We can then figure out something that where, like, as we just start collecting data together, that eventually we're going to get there to something that's, and it's a very precious thing that I'm so grateful to have had access to, and I don't know how much longer it's going to last. But I've been involved in 2 long-term ecological research sites, one in Phoenix, Arizona, and one in Baltimore, Maryland. In both of those cases, to me, again, so the another piece I'll talk about, so there was an institutional investment. There was an investment in bringing people together and saying, we want to see you all work together, and you're going to be rewarded for it in your careers for doing this, which is, it's unusual, I think, to have that kind of institutional investment. And another piece of it was that it was place-based. So that when I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, or I'm in, Baltimore, Maryland, and we're looking at at parks, and we're interacting with the community members who care about those parks, and we're interacting with hydrologists who look at how water flows through the city, and they're looking at how the green spaces are slowing down the water or affecting the ability of that to sort of trap pollutants or things like that. And I'm also looking at, hey, there's birds in these parks, and what kind of birds, and what would we need to do to have more birds in those parks? That we're all, connected by the place, and and the connection to place brings us together in a way that then we can start to see how we might have shared questions, or at least questions that are working towards some of the same kinds of like some underlying sort of values and underlying questions. I'll just put it that way, because the questions are not always the same. Sometimes it's actually hard to come up with joint questions. It might be that, like, to have a really kind of grant-worthy question around bird ecology, I'm going to ask things that really my colleagues that are doing hydrology or health outcomes or whatever aren't going to care about, and it's not going to be helpful to them. So we have to find the common questions, but we also have to give each other space to do the things that allow us to pursue our careers. So it's a very tricky balance to achieve. And again, having those institutional support that give you the time to communicate, the time to build relationships, and that's also necessary for any kind of collaboration that's outside of that academic setting. And so I'll just give one more example, if that's okay, time-wise here, that was really meaningful to me. So working with the Ecotarium in Worcester. So they wanted to make an exhibit about city science. And so we got together, so it was me and a geographer and a landscape architect, and we became part of this team that we wrote a grant together. So this is like, again, you need money to kind of have the time to do the things. And we got a grant that was about informal science education. And it was just like one of the biggest learning processes for me, because we would get together and we'd say, okay, we've got some ideas for your museum exhibit. You're probably going to laugh hard at this. It's like, we've got this idea about what you could do to like teach people about birds in the city, and they would be like, okay. So museum exhibit science is a science that we were trained in, and there's things that you're suggesting that we've tried before and don't engage people. People walk away from that, So it was a very, again, back to that humility part of it. I learned so much about the ways that you engage people and the ways that you can get people sort of thinking and grappling with ideas in a physical space that was so different from the way I had done in my sort of academic training.
Told you they were a good panel, right? This is really interesting stuff. I want to ask about every one of those examples. I know a little bit about that exhibit. I've been there. My kid loved it. Before we go on to the next question, though, I do want to say that the example you gave of the long-term ecological research stations brought two things to mind for me. One is that, that's an example of collaboration not only across locations and fields, but across time. Right, across decades. The researchers that are collecting data now, not only on the ground, but also I know that they integrate remote sensing data and all sorts of other stuff that they do across decades from these long-term, NSF-funded LTER stations, is really something that requires collaboration that you couldn't do the work without it. The outputs of these have been very valuable, which is why the program has lasted for so long. There are two people regionally that I think have done the exact kind of deep listening and collaborative work that you talk about, Dr. Warren. One of them, her name's Sarah Garlick. I don't know how many of you know them, but she's one of Katherine's colleagues at the Nature Conservancy. She used to run a program called Public Engagement at LTERs when she was at the Hubbard Brook Research Foundation, which ironically somehow is in both Woodstock, Vermont, and Woodstock, New York. At the station in Vermont, I think, what they did was they looked at the research questions that they had asked for their long-term ecological research station, and they asked a bunch of sort of, people who are not scientists to come and look at that question and say, how can the outputs of the work that NSF has funded be useful to you? And what would you like us to ask in our next round of research questions? So in addition to asking people who are on the grant as partners, they brought in a whole bunch of people who were just neighbors, right? They were residents of the area, they were loggers, they were people who ran ski resorts nearby, and they tried to think a little bit about how can this large-scale NSF-funded project serve the priorities that, help you do your work, and also how can we shape the next research questions to help you do your work in a way that is ecologically viable and help preserve biodiversity. That was really interesting. The second example is even closer to here. I think it's one of your colleagues, Scott, Pam Templer, who works, I think she's at Boston University, but she works on the Harvard Forest, similarly has done these kinds of dialogues with people who are impacted or close to the Harvard Forest, and helping them to inform research questions that can inform the long-term trajectory of the research that they do out there. I find that fascinating and interesting, and I want to use that as a transition to a little bit of hope, right? We said we were going to get to hope, and I said I wanted to focus on this question about how do we make sure that nature-based resilience solutions work for everyone. They serve everyone's needs. We all pay for both the research that goes into this and the solutions that are implemented, and we live with the impacts of how these solutions are implemented in communities and in ecologies as people living in the world. So I'm really interested in your ideas for lifting up inspiring, equitable ways that this has happened. Stories that you have about how this has worked really well. And Scott, can we start with you?
I was thinking that, this community engagement and the impacts on the public of science that we do is so important. And of course, Paige mentioned funding by the National Science Foundation. And of course, one of the two criteria by which the panels decide whether they're going to fund your grant is what's called broader impacts. And I would say NSF is almost unique in thinking about that aspect of it. Most federal agencies, it's very narrow, let's get the science done, that's it. NSF says, no, we want you to do great science, but we also want you to tell us how you're gonna affect a community broader than just your research lab. And that second criterion, I think, it's so important, and it's one mechanism whereby scientists and folks working in the field can get together and create the kinds of impacts that are really going to change the landscape. I think that one of the big trends we're seeing now is sort of community-driven research projects, and Paige and David alluded to this as well. How can we design an experiment that's generated by the public? What does the public want to know? And as Paige mentioned, it's not always the case that the scientists' interests and the public interests will align, but the challenge is finding that common ground. And I also just want to echo again Paige's comment about humility. I've had the privilege of working in lots of different countries around the globe, and it's really, really heartening when I can learn from local folks. I'm the newcomer. I'm the one who needs to learn from folks who've been there on the ground. And to be able to benefit from that sort of knowledge, and of course to acknowledge it and credit it, is super important. And now we're seeing a lot more evidence of I would say, very healthy partnerships between, say, scientists and folks in communities, indigenous communities, folks who've been on the land. And we're realizing, not just in fields like anthropology, the study of human cultures, but in zoology, studying animals and landscapes, that we need the local knowledge. Without the local knowledge, good science can't really take place. So it's a very exciting trend to see going on.
Thank you so much. Katherine, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, there was recently a report published by the World Health Organization on nature-based solutions for health, and I think that really sets a good agenda for some of the principles that we need to be thinking about, the equity principles, the scaling up the financing, the measurement, many other different aspects, and really cross-cutting, so nature-based solutions through a lot of different pathways. I think it also really comes down to context. So, there can be trade-offs in some cases for health in certain nature-based solutions, at least, temporarily, and I think when we look at the ecology, we can really appreciate that, but if we don't build in that consideration from the start, we might have some of those unintended consequences. And so we really have to be, taking that multi-sectoral approach in the planning, in the assessment, monitoring, and then changing course as needed. But I think there are some very exciting examples. I just want to give one or two case studies from that recent report. But one project that the Nature Conservancy has been a partner on is the Green Heart program in Louisville, Kentucky. And there's really high air pollution, there's really rapidly increasing heat exposure, and there's really low tree canopy cover, and actually decreasing because the trees in the city have not been well maintained. So NIH, National Institutes of Health funded a clinical trial of studying the effects of trees on health and communities. NIH said we can't fund the trees, we don't fund trees, we're not a nature organization, so TNC was able to step in and provide that expertise and support. And the results have been really remarkable. So the study is ongoing, but some of the outcomes so far have been really profound in terms of cardiovascular disease risk and indicators like C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker, and really, significant impacts. But then I think even more significant in terms of overall community engagement is, the planting of the trees. It was really a vocational component to a community cohesion component, and there was a program you could be a treecipient if you wanted to request trees and learn how to plant them and maintain them. So really that engagement. So not just this passive intervention, which is important in itself, greening, but really being part of it and seeing the benefits. I think that's really important for that ownership and sustainability. And again, I would just come back to, we need these broad principles. We need this systematic way of monitoring. And right now we are working on an inventory of health impacts from TNC projects that we hope will be useful for, beyond TNC as well, sort of that measurement, how do we do that well? But I think at the same time we have to appreciate context, and that sometimes the framings of health, we don't have all the answers and the right way of framing, so we're still learning every day on this too.
Thanks so much. Paige, I know when we were talking earlier, you were saying that there's a lot of urban greening work that connects to some of your, points of hope, your inspiration. Anything you want to talk about in that realm?
Sure, yeah, I think maybe I'll pick up on the tree thing there, because I think there's so many different kind of angles on that, and I wanted to just sit and listen to you for a little while longer, because that was really cool. So one piece of hope is I've been doing this for 20 years, and we've been talking about the need to do these kinds of co-production of knowledge, co-produced projects, and to see that things are happening, and the sort of to get actually quantified outcomes, measuring those health outcomes from tree planting or whatever is something that we've been striving for a long time. So to be able to get that, that's just so exciting. And so I'll kind of then go back in time a little bit to some work that we were developing in Boston in partnership with an organization called the Urban Ecology Institute, which no longer exists. But, and so one of my strategies as an academic to try to work in partnership is to find organizations to plug into. It's very difficult as a professor doing all the professor things to do the sort of community building, relationship building that really needs to happen to do a really authentic co-production kind of work. And so my strategy for that has been to try to plug into people who are already sort of working in the community. There's other ways of doing it, and we also need to foster ways in which professors who do want to have that really community embedded work have the opportunity to do that as well. So Urban Ecology Institute was an organization, had the City Roots program. It was working with neighborhood leaders who wanted to do some kind of greening project in their neighborhood. They had an idea. They had a thing they needed. They might not be sure exactly how to implement it or how to get where they wanted to go. So then City Roots was going to bring the expertise and bring the financial resources to do a planting project, to convert a vacant lot into a community garden, to all those, a whole different range of different kinds of community greening projects. So we said, okay, great, this is a fantastic thing, because scientists need sample sizes. In order to quantify those health outcomes, you need sample sizes, and yet projects tend to be done at a sort of small scale, and especially to do a community-driven project, that is by definition at a smaller scale. So how do we get that? How do we sort of bring that, scale that up in some way to get the sort of, to show this impact, right? And be able to quantify, what does it mean for biodiversity? What does it mean for people? So we were like, this is going to be great. And so we were going to do a whole pre-post thing. We were going to track all of their projects, and we got funding to do it. And the Urban Ecology Institute had turnovers in leadership and unfortunately sunsetted. So and I think this is a thing that happens with nonprofits. It's a thing. There's organizations have leaders, and leaders move on to other things, and sometimes it's hard for the organization to keep going. So these are I'm talking about challenges. I'll get to the hope, but So what we were able to do, though, is to look at all the projects they had done. We had the database of and so we went to all those neighborhoods, and we were able to sort of do a bunch of things, measure vegetation, we did some other sort of social survey work, and I'll just talk a little bit about the biodiversity side of it, where we counted birds in places where a small-scale community greening project had been implemented, and at another random location 250 meters away, so we would have different birds. And in some of those 250-meter away random places, you actually ended up in a place that was even greener than the place that had been. So we had to, account for that. But when we did that, that difference between the sort of place where greening had been added under city routes and a random location, we found this difference even a very small scale addition of greenness brought one more bird to that neighborhood, one more bird species to that neighborhood. And it didn't bring like a whole different bird species. You didn't get albatross showing up or something like that. But you got the normal birds that you would see, but you just got more species of them showing up. Robins and grackles and things like that these are the rich sort of tapestry of birds that are the Northeast. And so it was just amazing to me that we could even, and the amount it took to get one more bird was 150 square meters, which is basically like 2 parking spaces. So it really didn't take much, and it was astounding to me that we could actually pick that up out of a sample of green spaces. So that's, I guess, one piece of the hope is that sometimes it doesn't take much to make a difference. And then when we looked at kind of and we did some scenario work on tree planting and figuring out how to move the needle. Could you move the needle towards more equity in terms of tree canopy cover in the city of Boston? And it's, okay, there's challenges. I'm going to talk about some challenges again. The physical infrastructure is already there in cities, right? So when you want to go and try to, and you have disparities in where there is greenness and where there's tree canopy cover, we weren't going to do a scenario in which you like bulldoze giant sections of the city, although things like urban renewal projects did things like that in the past in ways that were inflicted upon communities rather than done in connection with communities. So we wanted to look at what scenarios you could do that were just taking with the infrastructure that's there. And cities have a lot of physical infrastructure that make it difficult for trees to grow, and especially difficult to grow large trees that make shading and canopy and the kinds of things that will actually, clean the air and do all of those things, although they also sometimes put out pollen that can affect. And so there's like all these trade-offs. So I think we can find hope even while we look at complexity. So we have to acknowledge the trade-offs. Like you mentioned trade-offs. We can't only find win-win scenarios always. And so how do we navigate the times when there are trade-offs? What do we prioritize, and how do we do that together in a collaborative way? And that's where I think that I just love hearing about projects like that, because it does sound like they found some win-win scenarios. And in our work, I think we could point to areas where it says, well, here are some of your choices. You can make a difference with a small amount of added green space. If you add it to an area that already has green space and you expand existing so that this sort of species area effect, more area, more species, but then you're adding to places that already have it. So if you want to move towards equity, you need to add greenness to places that don't already have it. That may have a less total biodiversity impact, but it might have a bigger impact for those communities. So these are choices we have to make, and we have to figure out the sort of democratic governance ways to do it.
Start thinking of questions. We're going to get to your questions in a minute. A couple things that you all said. I mean, one thing that's making me hopeful is I think what you talked about, Paige, is that each of these people are doing a lot of listening and thinking about their research and what it needs to look like going forward. And you've got 3 people that are directing not just research they're doing themselves, but that their institutions are doing. And that's really exciting to think a little bit about this role of, community engaged research and research that can serve multiple purposes, helping communities and then doing this global scale work that we need to help think a little bit about how these nature-based solutions will work in different places. When you were talking, Paige, I thought about one thing that I was involved in with the Mystic River Watershed Association that Dr. Dafforn mentioned. And we learned for sure, and it didn't surprise us very much, that across the 21 or 22 municipalities in the Mystic River watershed that we have here, some of them had, very, very different amounts of tree cover, and that was significantly associated with, temperatures that people were experiencing during heat waves. And when we went and talked to communities about that, they brought up some of the stuff that you described, which is that, yes, but we can't put trees here. There's no way, especially in East Boston, where the tree cover is about 3% compared to 40% in some of the other communities in that watershed, there's just no room for it. And so we spent time thinking about, well, what is it that we value? And we did two things. One of them was we all went to Belle Isle Marsh together, which, if you don't know, it was mentioned in some of the sessions yesterday, is on the intersection of Revere and East Boston, and it has almost no trees in it. There are like 4 trees in Belle Isle Marsh, and the reason is because it is land that is in its original condition of salt marsh. And it helped us all think about, well, what are things that might be done in an urban planning perspective where you could restore small amounts of salt marsh in places where trees may not be, tenable. And it led to a project that the Mystic River Watershed is still doing, where they went into 4 communities that were hot, and they actually asked the communities, well, what do you want to see in terms of our cooling solutions? And yes, the goal is to reduce the temperatures in there, but they also are saying, they have community listeners that they hired to say, is this doing what you were hoping it would do from a community perspective, from an ecosystem services perspective, and also from a bringing the community together perspective? If we build this resilience strategy, is it providing some social function, for example, that I think we heard a lot about yesterday, and we heard Brian Sweat talk about how the really smart and innovative things the city of Boston are doing. Really quickly, I think you've already been talking about the role of local knowledge and how important it is to rise up and think a little bit about local knowledge in these solutions when we implement them and when we envision them. Let's transition quickly to the role of traditional and indigenous ecological knowledge, which has been such an important part of this conference over the last 2 days. And it was a huge focus in the first ever National Nature Assessment. There were 2 chapters specifically donated or dedicated to that issue, which wasn't the case with the National Climate Assessment. It certainly talked a lot about it, but this had 2 whole chapters dedicated to this issue, and I think every chapter had to address it in one way or another. Why is this so important, and where are some illustrative ideas at the intersection of equity, traditional ecological knowledge, and resilience planning that the audience might be hopeful about or excited to hear? And I'll just open this up for anybody that wants to chime in.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I was fortunate enough to be part of the National Nature Assessment group that was writing these reports. I wasn't on the chapters involving indigenous knowledge, but I was involved with a chapter focusing on so-called bright spots, reasons for optimism in terms of conservation and restoration. It was a challenging experience. Of course, started under the Biden administration and now sadly canceled. But challenging because, you're having to reach a consensus with other authors with different expertises. But on the other hand, there was going to be a public comment period where folks could chime in. And I think that indigenous knowledge really was going to sort of have its imprint throughout the entire document. I think what we're seeing in so many ways in communities all over North America and all over the world is having that local knowledge, having the tradition of having seen the landscape change with climate change and sea level rising and changes in abundance of different species that communities might rely on. That's the kind of perspective that, it's hard for scientists to get that. Ironically, we have tools now to monitor biodiversity on huge scales across the globe with remote sensing, other kinds of satellite sensing of changes in tree cover, even animal populations. But it's that on-the-ground knowledge which has to be complemented with the sort of broad sweep of these global tools. And so that's, I think, where indigenous knowledge can come in.
Thank you so much. Other thoughts?
I can jump in a little bit. It's totally not my expertise. I can jump in just a tiny bit. I'm on the periphery of work on indigenous knowledge. We have a Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledge Systems at UMass Amherst, where I am. And so I have colleagues who are involved in this, and I haven't been as directly engaged in it. But I think what I've seen about that effort is that in addition to what you're talking about local, is about time and deep history, and that's through the sort of the indigenous knowledge systems that they're working on climate change. And here you have communities who have a heritage that can bring knowledge in a form that scientists are not used to grappling with, but that does bring important insights when we're thinking about deep time.
it's a really important opportunity to really learn from one another. You know, we're talking about this collaboration, and I think that within TNC, this was a gap in terms of our scientific capacity. We now have a Indigenous Sciences Director, very excited about the intersection with health. There's a lot that we will learn. We are really following the work of the Indigenous Determinants of Health team. There are some excellent, you know, at all levels. They're working a lot with the UN Permanent Forum. I would just say from my work with the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which I want to note, the US has never been a party to the CBD, and that convention, if you've heard about the Global Biodiversity Framework, all the financing, the 30 by 30 target, you know, so I think that's a lesson also. Don't be too discouraged by the present moment in terms of US leadership, because there are a lot of other countries that really are playing their role, and so please do get involved there. I think the CBD is really leading the way in terms of these connections, Indigenous knowledge-led processes. There's a lot more progress that needs to happen, but I think in the health space, in terms of biodiversity and health, there's a lot happening with really that core of Indigenous knowledge, ways of knowing, ways of doing, and if we think about something like traditional medicine, really the compounds that serve for thinking about biomedical research here in Boston, so much of that has benefited from Indigenous knowledge, and often not in the right ways, so there's a lot to learn in terms of the future. But I would just say, please engage. If you're with the City of Boston, please engage in the CBD processes. The Secretariat is in Montreal, so not too far away. But please bring your important expertise, again, because the US presence won't be what it was, but that's, you know, again, there's importance of showing from the city's lens what's happening, and I think that's a key opportunity for us.
Thanks so much. We're almost out of time. I just got my little 5-minute time left. Are there any questions that anybody in the audience wants to raise? If so, just raise your hand up high and someone will come over. I see John Bolduc with his hand up. That is a nature-based solutions hero raising his hand right there.
Yeah, hi, thank you, very interesting. So I've worked in urban environmental planning for a long time, and in our work, I saw that where we made progress was because we measured stuff, right? So there's been progress in measuring things like urban forests, doing urban forest assessments and master plans, doing urban heat island mapping, like the kind of work that David has led. We, of course, do a lot of flood and stormwater modeling. But around biodiversity and nature in cities, there are exceptions, but there's not a lot going on. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the kinds of things that we should be counting, mapping, modeling on a basic level so that cities have the information they need to manage this. And I'm thinking of, you know, we know like bird collisions with buildings are a major source of bird mortality, but cities don't do anything about it because they don't see it because they don't measure it, right? Or yesterday, Brian Sweat talked about pollinator highways. But it struck me, to do that effectively, you have to know what kind of pollinators you have, where they are, where they're not, where their habitat is, where it's not, that sort of thing, right? So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about thinking beyond trees, what should we be counting, mapping, and modeling?
I'll jump in to start with, yeah, and there are some really neat nationwide monitoring on phenology of flowering that does connect to tracking pollinators. So I can't remember exactly the name of that phenology network but they have people put out, well, there's that, but there's also one where they actually just had people all plant the same plants in different places, and then you could actually like watch the pollinator. So anyway, there's some of that happening, I guess I would say, that you're referencing. So tracking pollinators, yeah, and I think your question was like, what do we need to be doing, right? So yeah, and yeah, I think birds and pollinators are some of the easier things. Soils and temperature and things like that are also critical. Temperature, you get lots of different ways of getting at. Yeah, there's some really creative projects going out there. I just got a message about another one where people are, again, trying to sort of send out packets of things so that there's the same I think this was a plant thing again, where it's sort of, but it was like, everybody have this thing in your city, and then you sort of monitor what happens to it. So then we get that sort of global sense. At the local scale, though, I think then there are these sort of different questions about what's unique to your city. What are the things that make your city unique? And maybe those are the things that need to be sort of treasured and monitored. I think about the bats under the bridges in Austin, Texas, or something like that. Like, this is something that makes that city really unique, and is a truly sort of treasure. So maybe there's some things that are just specific to particular areas that people need to sort of work together to identify.
I think we're about to get the big cane pulling us off, but before we do, two things I want to say is what you talked about just now, Paige, makes me think of a story, and Amy Bonanno, who's on the faculty here at UMass Boston, would be able to talk about this much better than I would. But one thing that gives me hope is the revolutionary and sort of disruptive impact of public participation in scientific research, which you all talked about. And coming up next week, people around the world are going to be doing the City Nature Challenge. And if you don't know what that is, it's as simple as can be. You just take a picture with iNaturalist like you always would, but the data are like kind of like a global BioBlitz, and it started as a friendly competition between two science museums in California in 2016. They sort of said, all right, let's have a day-long contest, and it turned into now this like 3-day thing that literally 20 million people every year participate in. And you can go online and see which cities participate and which ones win. There's one in Brazil that kicks everybody's butt every year. And it's just, to me, that's hope. The idea that people are working together across civic boundaries and across time to answer these questions. Want to close just by saying a couple of things that I think can be next steps beyond just go out and do the City Nature Challenge. Find Amy if you want. She'll tell you all about it. She's here. One is that, as was mentioned yesterday, we made it that you can go to the Museum of Science for free over the next couple of days while the conference is here. There is a component on the living seawalls that Dr. Dafforn talked about yesterday in her keynote, and that the Children's Museum is hosting as an example of a nature-based solution. And I think these kinds of collaborations and opportunities to showcase work as it's happening should happen. So find your local science museum, tell them they should be covering the work that you're doing, and come up with a team like these 3 really interesting and smart people. And in June, I want to plug something that's happening because I think it connects so well with some of what you all are talking about. At the Museum of Science on June 18th, we're hosting an event in the evening with Robin Wall-Kimmerer, which I think is going to be a really wonderful next step for this, focusing on the role of us as humans connecting to nature and thinking about what it can do to help us envision the solutions that we need to take on these big challenges. And we're planning that with Amira Madison, who used to be at the City of Boston as their Chief of Indigenous Science and Planning, and now has just moved to be one of Scott's colleagues at Harvard. And I think that this is the idea. We need to listen to communities and find out how to take, when you bring somebody like that to Boston, how do you have everyone participate? So we're going to be inviting all of the groups that are working on these local nature-based solutions to talk with each other and to talk with people that are there to see her, because I think highlighting some of these local innovators and hopeful stories is really what we need right now. What a great panel. I want to thank the Stone Living Lab for bringing us together and all of you for participating and listening. Let's give one more hand to these amazing panelists. Thank you.